The story opens deep inside a dark, burning realm where Thor hangs in chains as a captive, surrounded by monstrous creatures. Suspended in front of a towering fire giant, he slowly spins while staring directly at the terrifying demon known as Surtur. The creature recognizes him immediately, calling him the son of Odin and warning him that Asgard's future is already doomed. According to the prophecy of Ragnarok, the mighty kingdom is destined to collapse into destruction. Surtur proudly explains that the flaming crown resting on his head is the very source of his immense power. Before the demon can continue, Thor subtly stretches out his hand. Far away, his enchanted hammer suddenly rockets through the air toward him. The weapon smashes through the cave at full speed and crashes into his shackles, shattering the chains instantly. Freed at last, Thor leaps straight into battle. He tears through the demon army with brutal force, smashing creature after creature aside with his hammer. The battlefield erupts into chaos as fire-covered beasts charge him from every direction. Surtur's soldiers attack relentlessly, but Thor keeps pushing forward, surviving even direct blasts of scorching fire. Eventually, he overpowers the fire demon himself, ripping away Surtur's blazing crown before placing it over his own shoulder as proof of victory. While escaping the collapsing realm, Thor contacts a man named Scourge. Scourge controls the Bifrost in Heimdall's absence, and Thor instructs him to activate the bridge. Scourge inserts his weapon into the mechanism, opening the glowing portal between worlds. Seconds later, Thor is pulled through the Bifrost and lands back near him. Thor immediately asks about Heimdall, the longtime guardian of the bridge. Scourge nervously explains that Heimdall has been branded a traitor. According to him, Heimdall abandoned his duties and disappeared before standing trial for disobeying Odin's orders. Without wasting time, Thor spins his hammer and launches himself toward Asgard. Flying across the shining city, he notices strange changes everywhere. One massive statue stands proudly with open arms, and crowds gather nearby to watch a dramatic stage performance. Confused, Thor approaches the scene and suddenly shouts, "Father!" But the old king standing before the audience is not truly Odin. The ruler is actually Loki disguised through magic. Thor casually tosses Surtur's crown toward him and tells him to lock it away inside the vault, so the fire demon can never regain his full form and destroy Asgard. As he talks, Thor confidently throws his hammer into the air, bragging that nothing can stop it. Then, with a suspicious look, he grabs Loki by the back of the neck. At that exact moment, the returning hammer flies dangerously close to Loki's face. Forced to drop the illusion, Loki transforms back into himself in front of the shocked crowd. Thor had recognized him all along. Thor immediately demands answers about Odin's disappearance. Loki complains that everything in Asgard had finally become peaceful before Thor returned and ruined it again. But Thor's patience quickly disappears. Stepping closer with clear anger, he accuses Loki of harming their father. He slams Loki down and pins him beneath the weight of the hammer, forcing him to confess what really happened to Odin. The next scene shifts to New York City, where Thor and Loki arrive dressed in ordinary Earth clothing. They walk through a busy construction area searching for clues about Odin's location. Suddenly, a glowing magical circle ignites around Loki's feet. Before he can react, he is violently pulled away and vanishes underground. Thor looks around in confusion until he notices a strange card lying nearby. Written on it is an address, 177A Bleecker Street. Following the clue, Thor reaches the mysterious location and knocks on the door. Moments later, he somehow finds himself inside without understanding how he entered. Floating nearby is a strange man wrapped in magical energy. The man greets him by calling him the God of Thunder. Thor stares at him suspiciously and asks if Earth now has sorcerers as well. The man calmly replies that he prefers the title, Master of the Mystic Arts. This mysterious figure is Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange explains that he keeps watch over threats arriving on Earth, especially dangerous beings from other worlds. He mentions that Loki's reputation is already well known and asks Thor why he brought him back to Earth. Thor explains that he is only searching for Odin. Strange then offers a deal. If he reveals Odin's location, will Thor and Loki immediately leave Earth and return to Asgard afterward? Thor agrees without hesitation. Doctor Strange reveals that Odin is currently in Norway. Thor then requests that Loki be returned safely. Using his magic once again, Doctor Strange instantly brings Loki back. In the blink of an eye, the three of them are transported to a peaceful open cliffside overlooking the water. There, sitting quietly near the edge, is Odin himself. Older, weaker, and nearly blind, the former king gently greets his sons. He tells them he has been waiting for them because his time has finally come. Odin softly explains that their mother is calling to him and that he is dying. Thor quickly insists that everything is under control now. He proudly says he stopped Ragnarok by defeating Surtur. But Odin sadly tells him that Ragnarok was never truly prevented. Something far worse is already approaching. Thor asks what he means. Odin finally speaks the terrifying name, Hela. He reveals that Hela is the goddess of death, his firstborn daughter, and the hidden sister of Thor and Loki. Long ago, her violent hunger for conquest grew beyond even Odin's control. Unable to stop her destruction, he imprisoned her away from the realms. But now, with Odin nearing death, the prison holding her back is weakening. Odin warns them that Hela draws her strength directly from Asgard itself. Once she returns there, her power will become nearly unstoppable. Thor desperately asks whether the three of them together can defeat her, but Odin sadly tells them this battle will belong to them alone. As the wind blows across the water, Odin's body slowly begins glowing with golden energy. The light surrounds him completely before drifting upward into the sky. Right in front of Thor and Loki, the king of Asgard peacefully fades away forever. The moment Odin disappears into the glowing sky, the atmosphere changes completely. Thor stands frozen in shock, overwhelmed by grief and confusion. Electricity begins crackling around his hands as waves of thunder energy pulse through his body. Then suddenly, a strange green portal tears open in front of them. Out of the glowing light steps Hela. The goddess of death finally stands before them in physical form. Calm, confident, and terrifyingly powerful, she slowly approaches Thor and Loki before commanding both of them to kneel. She coldly declares herself their rightful queen. Thor immediately refuses. He stares directly at her and says he would never bow before someone like her. Without hesitating, he hurls his hammer straight toward her face. But the next moment shocks everyone. Hela casually catches the hammer in one hand. Thor watches in disbelief as cracks spread across the weapon. Within seconds, she crushes the legendary hammer into pieces with almost no effort at all. Fragments explode through the air while Thor stands completely stunned. For the first time, his most trusted weapon is gone forever. As dark energy erupts around her, Hela's appearance transforms. Massive black horns extend from her head, and deadly blades materialize in her hands. Her true form finally reveals itself. Meanwhile, Loki panics. Looking upward toward the sky, he desperately shouts for the Bifrost to bring them back to Asgard. The Rainbow Bridge suddenly pulls Thor and Loki upward through space, but Hela immediately follows them into the portal. Inside the violent energy stream of the Bifrost, Hela attacks both brothers mid-transport. Loki loses control first and gets thrown out of the bridge into the darkness below. Thor tries to resist, but Hela turns toward him and strikes him as well, forcing him out of the portal too. Not long afterward, Hela successfully arrives in Asgard. At the Bifrost Observatory, Scourge prepares to activate the bridge again, but before he can react, Hela storms forward and slaughters the guards surrounding the area. Using sharp weapons that appear from nowhere, she wipes out soldiers effortlessly. Bodies collapse across the bridge within moments. Terrified, Scourge realizes he has no chance against her power. Instead of fighting, he quickly submits himself to her authority. Hela notices this immediately and smirks. She tells him that survival instincts make him smarter than the others. Far away from Asgard, Thor crashes onto a strange alien world. Debris from the broken Bifrost rains down around him as he lands near shallow water. Before he can recover, strange scavenger-like aliens emerge from nearby ships and attack him. Thor instinctively reaches out his hand, expecting his hammer to fly back toward him. But then reality hits him. The hammer no longer exists. Forced to rely only on his own strength, Thor begins fighting the aliens with his bare hands and lightning abilities. At first, he overpowers several of them easily, but the attackers use advanced weapons that trap him inside an electrified metal net. Chained and restrained, Thor is overwhelmed as the creatures swarm him together. Suddenly, another ship descends from the sky. A mysterious woman steps out from it and immediately opens fire on the aliens, killing them one after another with brutal precision. Just when Thor thinks she is helping him, she activates a shocking disc that knocks him unconscious instantly. When Thor regains consciousness later, he finds himself strapped into a moving chair inside a bizarre futuristic city. Massive cosmic portals glow across the sky, surrounding the strange planet. The woman who captured him has delivered him to the ruler of this place in exchange for a massive payment. That ruler is the eccentric and unpredictable Grandmaster. The Grandmaster cheerfully explains that he controls a massive gladiator-style contest where warriors from different worlds are forced to battle for entertainment. He proudly tells Thor that countless fighters arrive there unwillingly, and now Thor is one of them too. Thor refuses to accept his situation and insists he has no interest in participating because he must return to Asgard immediately. While looking around the room, Thor suddenly notices Loki standing nearby completely unharmed. Furious, Thor calls out to him, but Loki pretends not to know him in front of the Grandmaster. Thor immediately exposes him anyway, loudly announcing that Loki is his brother. Amused by the situation, the Grandmaster introduces Thor as the so-called God of Thunder. Then he offers him a deal. If Thor can defeat the arena's undefeated champion, he will earn his freedom and the chance to leave the planet. Thor confidently asks where this champion is. Instead of answering properly, the Grandmaster has Thor locked inside a holding area. There, Thor meets a giant rock-like creature. The Stone Warrior explains that almost nobody survives against the Grandmaster's champion because the fighter is unbelievably dangerous. Back in Asgard, Hela officially takes control of the kingdom. Standing before the surviving soldiers, she announces herself as Odin's firstborn child, the rightful heir to the throne, and the true ruler of death itself. She orders everyone before her to kneel. Hela then reveals that Odin is dead. She claims Asgard was once feared across countless realms and that no force could challenge their dominance. According to her, conquering other worlds was always their destiny, and she has returned to rebuild that empire once again. One brave warrior from the crowd refuses to accept her authority. He steps forward and warns Hela that she must surrender regardless of who she claims to be. Otherwise, the Asgardian army will show her no mercy. The threat only enrages her. Dark energy explodes around Hela as her horned form appears once again. The soldier charges toward her with his weapon raised, but he never stands a chance. Hela massacres him along with the entire force surrounding him. Within moments, the palace floor is covered with bodies. Watching the slaughter nearby, Scourge becomes deeply disturbed by what he sees, but Hela barely reacts emotionally. She coldly remarks that the soldiers died for nothing because they never understood the truth of who she really was. Afterward, she takes Scourge deeper into the palace and shows him the hidden history of Asgard. Massive paintings decorate the walls, celebrating Odin's glorious rule, but Hela calls them lies. She destroys the artwork one piece at a time, exposing older images hidden underneath. The hidden murals reveal a darker truth. Odin and Hela once conquered realm after realm together through violence and bloodshed. Hela proudly explains that she was the weapon that helped build Asgard's empire. One kingdom after another fell before them, and with every victory, her hunger for power only grew stronger. Eventually, Odin feared what she had become. Unable to control her anymore, he imprisoned her and erased her existence from history like a disgraceful secret. Back in Asgard, Hela continues taking control of the kingdom piece by piece. She walks toward the vault containing the legendary Eternal Flame, an ancient source of mystical fire capable of restoring life. Raising the burning energy in her hand, she drives her weapon into the floor and breaks open a hidden passage beneath the palace. Jumping down into the darkness below, Hela enters a massive underground chamber filled with the skeletons of dead warriors buried long ago. Standing before the remains, she announces that the eternal flame will awaken them once more. The fire spreads through the chamber, and one by one, the fallen soldiers rise back to life as undead warriors loyal only to her. Then she revives something even more terrifying. A gigantic black wolf named Fenris slowly awakens beside her. The monstrous creature growls as life returns to its enormous body. Now commanding an undead army and a giant beast, Hela finally takes her place upon Asgard's throne, while Scourge stands at her side leading her forces. Hela asks Scourge what he truly wants. Nervously, he admits that all he ever wanted was the chance to prove himself worthy. Hela seems amused by the answer. She begins telling him about her past, explaining that during her youth she carried out countless executions in Odin's name. But eventually she realized her role was greater than simply killing people. She was destroying entire visions, crushing anyone who stood against Asgard's expansion. That was when she became Odin's official executioner. Then she offers Scourge the same role beside her. According to Hela, their conquest is only beginning. Soon afterward, Hela and Scourge arrive at the Bifrost control chamber. But when they inspect the mechanism, they realize the sword used to activate the bridge is missing. Someone has stolen it. Hela immediately understands what happened. She explains that the sword is the key to controlling the Bifrost itself, and without it, the bridge cannot function. She blames Heimdall, believing he stole the weapon in order to secretly protect the remaining Asgardians from her rule. Meanwhile, far away on the alien planet Sakaar, Thor desperately searches for a way to escape. The rock warrior he met earlier, Korg, takes Thor into a storage area packed with weapons and tells him to choose something useful for the arena. Thor sadly comments that none of them compare to his lost hammer. He explains how the hammer once allowed him to fly by spinning through the air with it. At the same time, Thor finally learns the identity of the woman who captured him. She is actually Valkyrie, one of the legendary female warriors of Asgard once believed to be gone forever. Thor immediately asks for her help against Hela, but Valkyrie coldly ignores him and walks away, refusing to get involved. Not long later, the Grandmaster's gladiator contest finally begins. Inside the massive arena, Grandmaster enthusiastically introduces himself as the host of the event, while enormous crowds cheer around him. The atmosphere feels more like a bizarre game show than a fight to the death. Then the arena doors open high above, and Thor enters as the newest challenger, proudly introduced as the God of Thunder. The audience erupts with excitement, but the celebration quickly turns into shock when Thor's opponent finally appears. It is Hulk, the giant green warrior, storms into the arena roaring with rage. Thor's expression immediately changes from fear to excitement because he recognizes Hulk as his old ally, Bruce Banner. Thor happily shouts that he knows him from work, but Hulk has no interest in friendship. He charges forward and begins smashing Thor violently across the arena. Massive punches crash into Thor one after another, while the crowd screams with excitement. As the brutal fight continues, Thor suddenly experiences a vision of Odin encouraging him to discover the true source of his power. Lightning explodes across Thor's body as thunder energy surrounds him completely. Using that strength, Thor unleashes a devastating attack that throws Hulk across the arena with enormous force. For a brief moment, it looks like Thor might actually win, but before he can finish the battle, the Grandmaster secretly activates the obedience disc attached to Thor's neck. The electric shock instantly incapacitates him and robs him of victory. Later, Thor regains consciousness inside Hulk's private quarters. Hulk remains nearby, while Thor tries convincing him they need to return to Asgard together. He explains that Hulk originally arrived on Sakaar through a Quinjet spacecraft and reminds him that Asgard is in terrible danger. Thor insists that his homeland will be destroyed if they do nothing. While speaking, Thor stares out through the window and suddenly enters a strange vision-like connection with Heimdall. As Thor reaches out for help, Heimdall appears before him spiritually with glowing orange eyes. Heimdall explains that he can see Thor, but the distance between them is enormous. He also reveals that he has been secretly protecting the surviving Asgardians by hiding them far away from Hela's forces. After returning to reality, Thor continues trying to unite everyone. He asks Hulk for help and later approaches Valkyrie once again. Thor argues that they must stand together if they want any chance of saving Asgard. But Valkyrie still refuses. She warns Thor that Hela slaughtered the Valkyries long ago and claims Odin only imprisoned Hela because she became impossible to control. According to Valkyrie, Hela desires the throne above everything else and will kill anyone standing in her path. Thor responds that this is no longer about kingship or crowns. He only wants to save innocent lives before it is too late. Determined to escape Sakaar, Thor crashes through windows and leaps across several futuristic buildings while searching for the old Quinjet spacecraft. Eventually, he locates it and climbs aboard. Inside the ship, an old recorded message from a woman begins playing automatically. As Hulk enters behind Thor and hears the familiar voice, his emotions suddenly shift. The recording calms him enough for the Hulk persona to fade away, transforming him back into Bruce Banner after being trapped as Hulk for a very long time. Elsewhere, the Grandmaster becomes furious after discovering Thor's escape attempt. Angry that his prized champion has been stolen, he orders Loki and Valkyrie to capture Thor immediately. Both leave to track him down. However, after finally confronting Thor again, Valkyrie begins changing her mind. She eventually agrees to help him escape Sakaar and reveals that the only exit from the planet is through a dangerous cosmic wormhole. To survive it, they will need a powerful spacecraft. That leads them to a risky plan, stealing the Grandmaster's own ship. Loki then claims he knows the security codes needed to access the vessel, but Thor remains cautious because Loki has betrayed him countless times before. Back in Asgard, Scourge gathers civilians together while searching for the stolen Bifrost sword. Hela stands nearby watching silently, with the monstrous wolf Fenris resting behind her like a loyal guard beast. Then Hela signals toward a terrified young woman who has been dragged before her, preparing to make an example out of anyone who dares oppose her rule. The terrified young woman dragged before Hela can barely stop herself from crying. Fear spreads through the crowd as everyone realizes what is about to happen. Hela coldly orders Scourge to execute her publicly. She has no personal reason for killing the girl. She simply wants to terrify the people of Asgard into revealing the location of the missing Bifrost sword. Just before Scourge can carry out the order, a frightened boy suddenly steps forward from the crowd. Desperate to save the girl, he admits that he knows who stole the sword. The truth is finally revealed. Heimdall took the weapon in order to secretly protect the surviving Asgardians from Hela's massacre. The moment Hela learns this, she immediately heads toward Heimdall's hidden refuge, along with Scourge and her undead army. But by the time they arrive, Heimdall has already evacuated the civilians and begun leading them toward the Bifrost Bridge, the only remaining path to escape the destruction of Asgard. At the same time, Thor finally returns to Asgard alongside Bruce Banner and Valkyrie aboard a stolen spaceship. Valkyrie quickly arms herself for battle, while Thor marches directly toward the throne room. Holding a long staff in his hand, Thor slams it hard against the palace floor, announcing his arrival. The sound immediately draws Hela's attention. She enters the throne room with Scourge beside her and stares at Thor with disbelief that he survived. Hela begins speaking proudly about her bloody past, explaining that she once drowned entire civilizations in war and suffering beside Odin. According to her, Odin eventually became weak and abandoned their true destiny in favor of peace and mercy. Thor calmly tells her that he understands she is his sister, but he also knows she has become consumed by evil. That response enrages her. Hela demands that Thor leave the throne because she believes it rightfully belongs to her. Thor answers by repeating one of Odin's lessons, that a wise ruler never seeks war unnecessarily. But Hela immediately counters that a true king must always be prepared to fight, and then the battle begins. Thor and Hela crash through the throne room in a violent clash of lightning and blades. Despite Thor's strength, Hela overwhelms him with terrifying speed. During the brutal fight, she slashes directly across his face and destroys one of his eyes permanently. Thor collapses back in agony, now resembling Odin himself with only one eye remaining. Elsewhere, Heimdall continues leading terrified Asgardian civilians across the Bifrost Bridge in hopes of getting them safely onto the escape ship. But suddenly, Hela's gigantic wolf Fenris charges onto the bridge and attacks the fleeing crowd. Panic erupts everywhere as the massive creature tears through the bridge. At that exact moment, Bruce Banner realizes there is only one possible way to stop it. Even though he recently returned to human form, Banner transforms back into Hulk and leaps directly at the monster. The two giant creatures begin smashing into each other across the bridge, while Valkyrie attacks from above using the spaceship's weapons. Meanwhile, Scourge and Hela's undead forces launch their own assault against Heimdall and the remaining defenders. Scourge demands the return of the stolen Bifrost sword as the battle intensifies around them. Then unexpectedly, help arrives. Korg and the other revolutionaries from Sakaar suddenly appear to aid the Asgardians. Shortly afterward, another familiar voice echoes across the battlefield. It is Loki. Arriving with a massive ship, Loki proudly announces that rescue has arrived and urges everyone to board immediately. For once, Loki genuinely chooses to help save his people instead of abandoning them. Back inside the palace, Thor continues fighting Hela alone. Exhausted and beaten down, he closes his eyes for a brief moment and suddenly sees a vision of Odin once again. Odin calmly speaks to him, reminding Thor that he never truly understood his own power. He tells Thor that even when he had both eyes, he only saw half the truth. Thor admits he cannot defeat Hela without his hammer. But Odin finally reveals the lesson Thor needed all along. The hammer was never the source of his power. It only helped him focus the power that already existed within him. Then Odin fades away once more. The realization changes everything. As Hela mocks him and asks what kind of god he truly is, thunder suddenly erupts through Thor's entire body. Lightning explodes around the throne room as energy surges from the sky itself. Massive bolts crash down across Asgard, while the palace begins collapsing apart under the force of Thor's unleashed abilities. Now fully embracing his true strength, Thor launches himself at Hela and devastates her armies with overwhelming lightning power. Soldiers are blasted away while thunder tears across the battlefield. At the same time, Hulk finally overpowers Fenris and throws the giant wolf into the waters below, seemingly ending the creature for good. Valkyrie and Loki continue helping civilians escape while fighting off the undead army together. But even after all of this destruction, Hela survives. Thor quickly realizes that defeating her through ordinary combat is impossible. Then he remembers something hidden deep within Asgard's vault, the crown of Surtur. Thor understands there is only one way left to stop Hela permanently. He tells Loki to retrieve the crown and place it inside the eternal flame. Loki immediately rushes toward the vault, while Heimdall continues loading civilians onto the escape ship. During the evacuation, Scourge finally redeems himself. Choosing courage over fear at last, he sacrifices his own life protecting the fleeing Asgardians from Hela's forces. Meanwhile, Loki places Surtur's crown into the eternal flame. Instantly, the fire demon is resurrected in colossal form. Towering above the entire kingdom, Surtur rises from the flames as Ragnarok finally begins for real. Thor looks directly at Hela and tells her that this monster is the only thing capable of destroying her. For the first time, even Hela looks uncertain. Aboard the escape ship, Thor, Loki, Valkyrie, Hulk, and the surviving Asgardians watch helplessly as the final battle unfolds behind them. Hela attacks Surtur desperately, but the giant fire demon grows even larger, covering the entire city in flames. Then, with one enormous strike, Surtur destroys Asgard completely. The kingdom collapses into fire and ruin, while Hela disappears along with it. Later, standing aboard the refugee ship, Thor quietly stares at his reflection and finally accepts the loss of his eye. He has now become much like Odin, scarred, wiser, and burdened with leadership. Thor then looks toward Loki and admits that maybe his brother is not entirely beyond redemption after all. In the end, it becomes clear that Thor has finally accepted his destiny, not simply as the god of thunder, but as the new king of Asgard. When people talk about the Thor films now, it's interesting how uneven the conversation has become. The first movie is usually remembered as the serious, Shakespeare-inspired entry. The Dark World tends to appear near the bottom of Marvel rankings. And then there's Ragnarok, the film that suddenly made audiences genuinely excited about Thor again. Honestly, it makes complete sense. Before this movie arrived, Thor always felt slightly confined within the MCU. Not ineffective exactly. Chris Hemsworth had always been compelling in the role, but compared to characters like Iron Man or even the Guardians team, Thor often felt strangely restrained. As if Marvel never fully decided what to do with him, beyond placing him in ornate armor and surrounding him with grand speeches about destiny. Then Ragnarok arrives and immediately changes the entire atmosphere. Not gradually either. Within the opening minutes, the film practically announces that the previous version is gone. Thor is making jokes in the middle of catastrophic situations. The pacing moves with far more energy. The visual palette becomes wildly vibrant, and the whole experience feels less like a traditional mythology epic and more like a collision between a cosmic opera and an offbeat comedy. On paper, that combination shouldn't function nearly as well as it does, but somehow, it absolutely works. What surprised me most revisiting the film is how effortless it feels. Around that period, many Marvel projects were becoming increasingly massive, increasingly loud, and increasingly focused on expanding the larger universe. You could almost sense the machinery operating behind them at times. Ragnarok still contains the large-scale visual effects, the destruction, and the franchise-level stakes, but it moves with far more confidence. There's a sense that it genuinely wants to entertain scene by scene rather than simply position pieces for the next installment. And people sometimes forget that when the movie released, there was already a growing sense of superhero fatigue beginning to emerge. Not full exhaustion yet, but audiences were becoming very familiar with the formula. Giant energy beams, interchangeable final acts, endlessly collapsing cities, heroes trading the same kinds of jokes. The repetition was becoming noticeable. That's part of why Ragnarok landed so effectively. The film wasn't afraid to embrace how absurd its own world could be. It features giant wolves, neon-drenched alien civilizations, Jeff Goldblum behaving like he wandered in from an entirely separate movie, Hulk as a gladiator, Cate Blanchett wearing one of the most extravagantly theatrical headpieces the MCU has ever seen. And somehow the film commits to every element completely while still maintaining a playful awareness of itself. That balance is incredibly difficult to maintain. Most films lean too heavily in one direction. They either become overwhelmingly self-serious or collapse into pure parody. Ragnarok manages to exist somewhere in between, and I think that's exactly why even viewers who were never particularly invested in Thor ended up enjoying it. I've seen countless reactions from people essentially saying, "I never really cared about Thor before, but this one was genuinely entertaining." That word appears constantly around this film, entertaining. Not important, not prestige cinema, just genuinely enjoyable in a way blockbuster filmmaking sometimes forgets how to be. It also helps enormously that Chris Hemsworth finally seems completely liberated within the role. Not that he lacked commitment before, but here he feels fully unlocked. It's as though someone finally recognized how naturally charismatic and funny he is and stopped forcing Thor into the mold of an overly rigid mythological prince. The humor actually enhances the character instead of diminishing his heroism. He becomes more approachable without losing his presence. And to be fair, I understand why some people still prefer the more dramatic interpretation of Thor. If you wanted a sweeping Norse fantasy driven by mythology, gravitas, and operatic emotion, Ragnarok probably felt like Marvel overturning the entire table and replacing it with a cosmic comedy performance. But honestly, that creative risk is likely what preserved the franchise. By the third film, repeating the earlier formula again may have pushed the character completely into the background. Instead, Ragnarok transformed Thor from the Avenger with the hammer into one of the MCU's most engaging personalities. And once the film locks into that energy, it rarely loosens its grip for the remainder of the runtime. What's especially fascinating about Thor Ragnarok is that it barely resembles a conventional third entry in a franchise. By the time most series reach movie number 3, they're either operating on autopilot or aggressively trying to prove their relevance. Ragnarok almost dismantles itself and rebuilds its identity in real time, because if you revisit the earlier Thor films, the tonal difference is dramatic. The first Thor carried Kenneth Branagh's influence everywhere. Dutch angles, theatrical family betrayals, Odin delivering speeches that sounded pulled from classical stage drama, Loki staring into the distance with overwhelming emotional intensity every few minutes. Marvel was essentially attempting Shakespeare through the lens of superhero cinema. And honestly, that film still possesses a certain charm precisely because it committed so fully to that style. Then the Dark World arrived, and you could feel the franchise beginning to lose momentum. Everything became visually flatter, more generic, more mechanically focused on saving the universe because the plot required it. Even people who defend that movie usually admit it lacks a strong identity compared to the rest of the MCU. Thor himself started to feel less like a fully developed character and more like someone being repositioned between crossover events. That's why Ragnarok feels refreshing almost instantly. It doesn't simply adjust the formula slightly. It launches the old formula into deep space and watches it burn. The film takes this mythology-heavy world filled with prophecies, gods, magical realms, and ancient legacies, then reframes it as a chaotic cosmic adventure comedy. Thor is no longer standing solemnly delivering royal speeches. He gets awkward, he panics, he becomes embarrassed. He argues with Hulk like two exhausted roommates trapped together on an unpredictable road trip, and strangely enough, that approach makes him feel more human than ever before. I think Marvel finally realized something important here. Thor works best when the character is allowed to be strange, not just noble or powerful, strange. A massive cosmic Viking traveling through neon-junk planets is already an inherently outrageous concept if you think about it for more than a few seconds, so instead of concealing the absurdity, Ragnarok embraces it completely. That's the critical distinction. Earlier Thor films often wanted the mythology to feel sacred and untouchable. Ragnarok still respects the mythology, but it also understands how entertaining and imaginative that mythology can be. There's a major tonal difference between an ancient prophecy of destruction and an ancient prophecy of destruction somehow involving Jeff Goldblum. And honestly, the franchise desperately needed that tonal evolution. By this stage in the MCU, nearly everything was becoming interconnected and polished to the point of predictability. Some Marvel films began feeling less like standalone adventures and more like mandatory viewing assignments for the larger universe. You watch them because they mattered to future installments, not necessarily because they possessed their own distinct identity. But Ragnarok has identity everywhere. You can feel it in the dialogue, the pacing, the color palette, the soundtrack choices, even the strange conversational pauses where characters simply react awkwardly to each other. The film feels looser in the best possible way, less engineered. There's an unpredictability to it that many MCU films at the time simply didn't possess. At the same time, I don't think the movie entirely abandons what originally made Thor compelling. Beneath all the humor, this is still a story about the collapse of a family, the weight of legacy, the loss of home, and Thor trying to understand what kind of leader he becomes once Odin is no longer standing above him. The difference is that the film doesn't pause every few scenes to deliver massive emotional monologues explaining its themes. Sometimes it simply allows the emotion to exist quietly underneath the chaos. And I understand why that tonal transformation frustrated some viewers, especially people who wanted a more traditional Norse epic. I remember a lot of reactions at the time asking why Thor had suddenly become comedic, which honestly is a fair reaction because the shift is enormous. But personally, I think if Marvel had produced another film in the exact style of the Dark World, the Thor franchise probably would have slowly disappeared into the background of the MCU entirely. Instead, Ragnarok gave the franchise something it had never fully possessed before, a distinct identity, not simply the cosmic side of Marvel, not merely the mythology division. This became the strange, vibrant, unpredictable corner of the MCU where virtually anything felt possible. And once audiences connected with that version of Thor, there was really no returning to the earlier approach. You can feel Taika Waititi's influence across the film almost immediately, and I don't just mean the humor. Plenty of directors can insert jokes into a blockbuster. This feels far more specific than that. It feels like someone entered the MCU and deliberately loosened the entire atmosphere. Before Ragnarok, Marvel films were already comedic, obviously. Tony Stark's sarcasm was built into the character. Guardians of the Galaxy practically ran on pop music and banter. Even the Avengers films were packed with constant one-liners. But Waititi's style operates differently. His humor is more awkward, more unpredictable. Sometimes it feels like the characters are improvising their way through catastrophic situations instead of delivering perfectly calibrated punchlines. That's probably why the movie feels so alive. If you've seen What We Do in the Shadows or Hunt for the Wilderpeople, you can immediately recognize his fingerprints here, the strange pauses. Characters delivering completely sincere dialogue, while the surrounding situation becomes increasingly absurd. Small moments where someone reacts in the least graceful way imaginable, and the film allows the silence to linger just slightly longer than expected. Earlier Marvel humor was usually extremely polished, set-up, joke, transition. Waititi allows scenes to breathe in a messier, more natural rhythm. Even the pacing of conversations feels different. Characters interrupt each other. Some jokes feel almost accidental. There are moments where Thor genuinely seems confused about what kind of movie he's suddenly trapped inside, and somehow that chaos makes everything feel more human. I think that's what surprised me most the first time I watched Ragnarok. It actually feels directed. That sounds like an odd compliment, but there are plenty of major franchise films where you can barely identify the person behind the camera. They hit the required story beats, they connect to the larger universe, they look expensive, but there's very little personality shaping the experience. With Ragnarok, even if you had no idea Taika Waititi directed it, you would still leave thinking, someone specific made this film. You feel it everywhere. The bizarre energy of Sakaar, the retro-futuristic sci-fi aesthetic, the deadpan humor layered into serious moments, the fact that one of the funniest characters in the entire movie is essentially a very polite rock creature calmly discussing revolution. That is such a distinctly Taika Waititi concept, and somehow he balances all that absurdity without completely dissolving the stakes. Honestly, that's more difficult than the film usually gets credit for. Because structurally, this story is incredibly dark. Thor loses his father. He loses Mjolnir. Asgard begins collapsing. Hela is eliminating entire groups of people back home, while Thor is stranded on the opposite side of the universe. If another filmmaker leaned too heavily into the comedy, the emotional foundation could have disappeared entirely. But Waititi generally understands when to pull back. Not perfectly, there are definitely moments where a joke arrives slightly too quickly after an emotional beat, but for the most part, the film recognizes that comedy works best when there's still something genuine underneath it. Odin's farewell scene works because the movie finally slows down and allows stillness into the frame. Thor's realization about what Asgard truly represents works because the emotion is permitted to land naturally instead of immediately being interrupted for another laugh. And then 5 minutes later, someone gets launched into a wall while Korg casually says something ridiculous. That rhythm should not function as smoothly as it does. What's also fascinating is how Waititi reshapes the actors themselves. Chris Hemsworth feels completely transformed here. Faster, looser, more instinctive. It's like someone finally gave him permission to stop portraying Thor as an untouchable mythological monument. Even Tom Hiddleston's Loki becomes funnier in a more organic way. Not simply theatrical villain funny, more like an exasperating younger brother who constantly creates chaos around himself. Then there's Jeff Goldblum, who essentially enters the film like a perfectly dressed disruption device and somehow still matches the tone flawlessly. Honestly, that may be Waititi's greatest strength in Ragnarok. He somehow aligns every performance onto the same wavelength. Nobody feels trapped inside a different version of the movie. Cate Blanchett is delivering this grand gothic goddess performance. Goldblum floats through scenes like an eccentric cosmic television host. Hulk behaves like a gigantic frustrated child, and yet the film never completely loses tonal cohesion. That's incredibly difficult to achieve, especially within Marvel's system, where directors sometimes have to operate within such carefully managed structures that their individual style gets softened. But Ragnarok feels like one of the first MCU films where the filmmaker's identity is impossible to miss. And I think Marvel recognized that too, because after this film, the studio became noticeably more willing to allow directors to inject stronger personalities into these projects. You can honestly trace part of Marvel's later, filmmaker-driven, phase directly back to Ragnarok. Whether that approach always succeeded afterward is an entirely separate discussion, but this was definitely one of the moments where the MCU realized audiences enjoyed watching directors experiment inside the sandbox, instead of simply following the same blueprint repeatedly. And Taika absolutely experiments here. What I really appreciate structurally about Ragnarok is that the film wastes almost no time pretending things in Asgard are stable anymore. The movie opens by immediately throwing Thor into chaos. There's no extended setup where everyone peacefully wanders through the kingdom before the actual story begins. Instead, we open with Thor literally chained inside a demon's cave while listening to a prophecy about the end of the world, which honestly tells you everything about the film's energy right away. That entire Surtur sequence is kind of perfect because it introduces the apocalyptic storyline while simultaneously introducing the film's new comedic identity. Thor is casually spinning in circles mid-conversation, while Surtur attempts to sound intimidating, and the movie is essentially announcing, "This is the new tone now, adjust accordingly." And I love that the film rarely slows down after that point. Thor returns to Asgard, immediately realizes Loki has been impersonating Odin, and suddenly the story jumps to Earth, where Doctor Strange is teleporting everyone through random rooms like he's amusing himself with the situation. That entire sequence feels far more playful compared to older Marvel introductions. Parts of it almost function like a surreal comedy sketch, especially with Loki looking genuinely unsettled every single time Strange appears unexpectedly. Then for a brief moment, the film shifts its rhythm entirely, because Odin's death scene is one of the rare moments where Ragnarok becomes genuinely quiet. No massive visual spectacle, no immediate punchline. Just Thor and Loki realizing that the figure holding their world together is disappearing. Anthony Hopkins plays the scene with this calm exhaustion that works far better than an overly dramatic performance would have. Then Hela arrives, and the film essentially detonates itself from there. That entire sequence where she destroys Mjolnir still carries enormous impact, not simply because it's visually striking, but because Marvel spent years treating the hammer as this untouchable mythical artifact. Then Cate Blanchett catches it with one hand and crushes it effortlessly. The film instantly establishes the scale of the threat without relying on lengthy exposition explaining how powerful she is. The audience immediately understands the situation. Oh, this is serious. What's funny, though, is how quickly the movie removes Thor from everything familiar after that moment. 1 minute we're immersed in Norse mythology and buried family secrets, and the next Thor is blasted through space and dropped into what essentially resembles a neon-soaked junk planet overseen by an intergalactic nightclub owner. Sakaar feels intentionally chaotic. It almost feels like the film wants Thor himself to feel disoriented. And honestly, that was a smart decision because it shifts the story away from royal destiny and into something far more immediate. Survival, Thor loses nearly everything within the opening stretch of the movie. His hammer is destroyed, Odin is gone, Loki disappears again, Hela takes control of Asgard. Thor ends up stranded across the universe, getting electrocuted by strangers and forced into gladiatorial combat for entertainment. It's probably the most stripped-down version of the character we had seen at that point. Then, of course, the movie delivers the Hulk reveal. And yes, everyone already knew Hulk was in the film because Marvel's marketing campaign placed him on practically every poster imaginable. But the arena sequence still works incredibly well, mostly because of Hemsworth's reaction. Thor seeing Hulk and immediately yelling, "Yes," like he just spotted an old friend at a sporting event completely transforms the mood of the entire scene. What could have been framed as an intimidating confrontation instantly becomes something much stranger and more entertaining. That's another thing the setup handles surprisingly well, actually. The film keeps assembling unlikely character combinations together. Thor and Hulk become this bizarre accidental comedy duo. Valkyrie enters the story as a heavily disillusioned former warrior who clearly wants nothing to do with heroism anymore. Loki keeps drifting in and out of loyalty, depending entirely on what benefits him most in the moment. Then Banner returns, and suddenly, the entire group dynamic changes again. By the time the Revengers joke arrives, the movie has essentially transformed into a cosmic disaster road trip story. And somehow, all of this chaos still circles back to Asgard collapsing under Hela's control. That's where the structure becomes really interesting, and maybe slightly uneven too, because the Sakaar storyline is so colorful, energetic, and entertaining that you almost forget there's an actual apocalypse unfolding back home. Hela is overtaking kingdoms and eliminating armies, while Thor is trapped inside what basically resembles a neon-drenched intergalactic sports comedy for a large portion of the runtime. Oddly enough, though, I think that imbalance is part of the movie's charm. It feels unpredictable, like the story genuinely has no interest in following the standard superhero blueprint. It keeps bouncing between mythological destruction and absurd comedy without ever fully committing to only one tone. Sometimes that works brilliantly, sometimes it becomes slightly uneven, but the film is almost never dull. And honestly, for a third entry in a franchise that could have very easily played things safe, I'll take ambitious unpredictability over another generic, Save the Kingdom storyline every time. One thing I really noticed revisiting Thor Ragnarok is just how quickly the movie moves, genuinely quickly, not in the exhausting modern blockbuster sense where every shot lasts 3 seconds, but in the way the film constantly propels itself forward before you have time to overanalyze anything happening on screen. And honestly, that's probably intentional, because if you stop and actually break down the plot structurally, this movie is kind of outrageous. There's an apocalypse prophecy, a hidden sister reveal, Odin's death, Loki impersonating Odin, Doctor Strange appearing briefly, Thor stranded on another planet, a loose adaptation of Planet Hulk, Valkyrie's backstory, gladiator tournaments, undead armies, giant wolves, Surtur, and then Infinity War setup layered into the ending as well. That is an enormous amount of material. Normally, a screenplay balancing that many moving pieces would feel overloaded or exhausting. Ragnarok somehow survives because it keeps moving before the audience has time to question the chaos too deeply. The pacing feels strangely confident. The film introduces an idea, extracts the most entertaining aspects from it, then immediately launches itself toward the next sequence. And somehow that momentum makes the experience feel lighter instead of more cluttered. Take the opening act, for example. In another Marvel film, Thor discovering Ragnarok would probably become an extended mystery storyline unfolding gradually over the course of the movie. Here, absolutely not. Thor fights Surtur, escapes, exposes Loki, finds Odin, loses Odin, encounters Hela, loses Mjolnir, and gets launched into space, all remarkably early in the runtime. The movie practically speedruns its own setup. And honestly, I kind of admire that because it gives the entire film this reckless confidence. You can sense the movie understands audiences already know the broader MCU formula, so instead of stretching exposition endlessly, it just keeps throwing characters into escalating disasters and trusts the momentum to carry everything forward. Most of the time, it absolutely works, especially once Sakaar enters the story. That entire middle section is where the pacing really locks into place for me. The film turns into this bizarre cosmic hangout adventure where Thor is trying to escape, but keeps getting pulled into increasingly ridiculous situations. One moment he's inside a gladiator arena, the next he's arguing with Hulk inside an apartment. Then Jeff Goldblum drifts through another scene dancing around like he wandered in from an entirely different genre. And somehow it never really loses energy. That's difficult to accomplish with a 2-hour superhero movie. A lot of Marvel films eventually hit a point where you begin noticing the machinery underneath everything. Setup, scene, joke. Action beat, emotional speech. Repeat. Ragnarok feels looser than that. Even scenes primarily designed to move the story forward usually contain some strange visual idea, awkward interaction, or unpredictable comedic moment keeping them alive. Now, does that mean the structure is flawless? Not necessarily. The biggest issue is probably that the film occasionally feels like two entirely different movies stitched together. There's the Sakaar storyline, which is colorful, chaotic, comedic, and functioning almost like a retro sci-fi adventure. Then there's the Asgard storyline, where Hela is overtaking an entire kingdom and eliminating people on a massive scale. Tonally, those storylines do not always merge perfectly. The movie can jump from a serious sequence about Asgard collapsing directly into Thor getting hit with another joke seconds later. Sometimes the film's confidence smooths over those transitions. Other times you can definitely feel the tonal whiplash. I also think Hela is slightly affected by the pacing. The movie moves so aggressively forward that it rarely pauses long enough to deepen her character, beyond being this overwhelming goddess of death. Cate Blanchett fully commits to the performance, but the film is so eager to return to the chaos of Sakaar that Hela occasionally feels like she's operating inside a darker fantasy epic happening parallel to the main story. Still, I would much rather watch a movie moving too confidently than one dragging itself toward the finish line. And Ragnarok absolutely never drags. Even the exposition scenes move surprisingly fast. Characters explain things while walking, while fighting, while jokes are happening around them. The film understands modern audiences have already experienced enough prophecy speeches and superhero origin explanations to last multiple lifetimes, so it avoids over-explaining whenever possible. That also helps the rewatch value tremendously, because once you already know the story, the movie still works through rhythm alone. The pacing keeps carrying you from one entertaining interaction to another, Thor and Loki arguing, Hulk being strangely emotional, Valkyrie pretending she doesn't care about anything, Korg casually discussing revolution with the energy of someone ordering coffee. Everything blends into this very specific flow that feels conversational rather than mechanical. Honestly, the structure of Ragnarok reminds me less of a traditional fantasy epic and more of a completely chaotic road trip movie. Characters constantly get sidetracked, alliances shift every 20 minutes, nobody entirely understands the plan, and somehow they still stumble their way towards saving the universe. And I think that messy spontaneity is exactly why the pacing works as well as it does, because even when the movie becomes overloaded, it almost never feels lifeless. The comedy in Thor. Ragnarok is honestly the element that either completely wins people over or completely loses them. There's rarely much middle ground. You either connect with this film's sense of humor almost immediately, or you spend the entire runtime wondering why Thor suddenly sounds like he joined an improvisational comedy group. For me, though, most of it genuinely works. And I think the reason it works is because the comedy isn't treated like decoration layered on top of the story. This isn't one of those superhero films where everything pauses every few minutes so a character can deliver a punchline. The humor is built directly into the movie's rhythm. It exists in the way characters speak, react, move through scenes, and completely fail to behave like majestic mythological gods during an apocalypse. Even the opening sequence tells you exactly what kind of humor the movie is operating with. Thor is literally suspended in chains speaking to Surtur, but instead of acting terrified or overwhelmingly heroic, he keeps interrupting the villain because the chain continuously rotates him away mid-conversation. On paper, that's an absurdly simple joke. Honestly, it sounds almost ridiculous when you describe it afterward, but the timing and delivery establish the film's entire tone perfectly. That's the thing about Waititi's style of comedy. A lot of the humor sounds strange when explained afterward, but it works because of rhythm, pauses, and performance. There are awkward silences everywhere in this movie. Characters say something and nobody responds immediately. Someone reacts with confusion instead of a polished one-liner. The comedy feels messy in the best possible way, more conversational, less engineered. Earlier Marvel humor often felt extremely polished and precise. Ragnarok feels more like people trying to survive complete chaos while accidentally being entertaining along the way. Thor benefits from this more than anyone. Chris Hemsworth finally gets the opportunity to use his natural comedic instincts, instead of constantly portraying Thor like a ceremonial statue, delivering speeches about honor and destiny. And strangely enough, making Thor funnier actually makes him more compelling. He becomes more human once the film allows him to panic, feel embarrassed, fail with confidence, or simply say something ridiculous without immediately trying to regain control of the moment afterward. That he's a friend from work moment still completely lands for me because it feels weirdly authentic. Thor doesn't react to Hulk like a mythological rival entering the arena. He reacts like someone unexpectedly spotting an old friend in the middle of total chaos. Then there's Loki. What I love is that Loki's humor isn't really based on traditional punchlines. It's reaction-based humor. Half of his funniest moments come from Tom Hiddleston, simply looking offended, horrified, betrayed, or deeply exhausted by everyone around him. The elevator scene works so well largely because Loki slowly realizes Thor's terrible plan somehow sounds even worse once spoken aloud. The movie also commits fully to absurdity in a way Marvel usually avoids. Korg is probably the clearest example of that. A giant rock alien speaking with the calm energy of the most relaxed person imaginable should not function nearly as well as it does. But the contrast between his appearance and the way he casually discusses revolution or prison life is so oddly specific that every scene becomes memorable. Honestly, some of the funniest moments in Ragnarok barely even qualify as traditional jokes structurally. They're just strange observations or awkward reactions. Jeff Goldblum's Grandmaster feels like a character operating inside his own private reality entirely. He speaks like he forgot which conversation he was participating in halfway through it. Every scene with him feels unpredictable because you genuinely don't know whether he's about to threaten someone or compliment their outfit, and the movie just keeps layering that strange energy on top of itself. The stage play sequence, Loki getting thrown around by Doctor Strange for what feels like an eternity, Thor repeatedly failing to activate the spaceship with voice commands, Hulk becoming emotionally offended during arguments, Valkyrie stumbling drunkenly off her ship. The humor constantly emerges from character, behavior rather than only from scripted punchlines. Now, does the movie occasionally overdo it? Honestly, yes, I think it does. There are definitely moments where Ragnarok becomes so committed to undercutting tension that it slightly weakens scenes that could have landed with more emotional weight. Sometimes the film arrives at a genuinely powerful moment and then immediately rushes toward another joke because it seems uncomfortable remaining in seriousness for too long. That criticism is completely fair, especially if you wanted more mythology, emotional gravity, and dramatic depth from Thor's story. I absolutely understand why some viewers felt frustrated watching scenes about Asgard collapsing transition almost instantly into comedy. But honestly, I think the reason the humor mostly succeeds is because the film never feels cynical about any of it. It's not mocking Thor for existing. It's not embarrassed by mythology, comic book absurdity, or giant cosmic spectacle. The movie genuinely enjoys how outrageous this universe is. There's a huge difference between laughing at something and laughing alongside it, and Ragnarok usually understands that distinction very well. That's also why the comedy ages better than I expected. A lot of MCU humor starts feeling overly scripted on repeat viewings. Here, because the performances are so loose and driven by character interactions, many of the jokes still feel surprisingly fresh. Some sequences honestly play more like self-contained comedy sketches hidden inside a massive science fiction fantasy film. And maybe that's the best way to describe Ragnarok overall. It's essentially a movie about the collapse of an entire kingdom where half the characters cope with stress by becoming comedians. Somehow, that ended up being exactly what the franchise needed. Honestly, beneath all the explosions, neon chaos, and Hulk destroying everything in sight, Thor, Ragnarok is still fundamentally a story about two brothers who absolutely cannot stop irritating each other. And that's probably why the emotional side of the movie works better than people sometimes acknowledge, because Thor and Loki have always been the emotional center of these films. Even back in the first Thor, before the MCU expanded into an enormous interconnected machine, the thing audiences connected with most wasn't necessarily the action or mythology. It was the emotional dysfunction between these two brothers, one desperately trying to become worthy, the other desperately trying to feel valued. Ragnarok simply changes how that relationship is presented. The earlier films approached their conflict with enormous dramatic intensity, grand betrayals, monumental speeches, Loki staring emotionally into the void while orchestral music surged around him. And to be fair, some of that material still works really well. But by the third movie, the relationship becomes much more entertaining because the film finally allows them to behave like actual siblings instead of symbolic mythological figures all the time. Which means half their interactions are essentially passive-aggressive arguments. Thor spends most of the film behaving like he fully expects Loki to betray him eventually, because realistically, he probably will. Meanwhile, Loki constantly looks exhausted that Thor somehow keeps dragging him into catastrophes, despite technically becoming the more responsible brother at this point, or at least the less openly destructive one. The chemistry between Hemsworth and Hiddleston feels so natural by now that the movie barely needs to explain their history anymore. They immediately fall back into their rhythm: threats, sarcasm, brief moments of emotional honesty lasting maybe 3 seconds before instantly collapsing back into manipulation and avoidance. That elevator conversation is probably one of my favorite scenes between them across the entire trilogy. Because underneath all the humor, there's this quiet sadness sitting beneath the surface. Thor talks about how he imagined they would always fight side by side when they were children, and for a brief moment, the movie completely drops its irony. Loki barely even knows how to respond to sincerity anymore. His entire personality has become layers of defense mechanisms stacked on top of each other. And what makes Loki especially interesting in Ragnarok is that he isn't really functioning as the villain anymore, but he's definitely still not trustworthy either. The movie never magically transforms him into a noble hero. He still lies constantly. He still betrays people whenever survival becomes inconvenient, but now Thor understands Loki better. There's far less shock whenever Loki does something selfish, because Thor has finally accepted that this is simply part of who his brother is. Oddly enough, that acceptance actually brings them closer together. Throughout the film, there's this quiet feeling that both of them are exhausted by the cycle they've spent years repeating. Thor is tired of pretending Loki will suddenly transform into a permanently noble figure. Loki is tired of pretending he doesn't care about Thor at all. So their relationship gradually stops being about good versus evil and becomes something much more complicated: two deeply dysfunctional brothers trying to figure out how to exist around each other without destroying everything in the process. Honestly, that feels more emotionally mature than the earlier films at times, and the humor strengthens that dynamic enormously because the comedy doesn't erase their history, it exposes it. The get help scene is funny mostly because you instantly believe these two have been doing ridiculous things like this since childhood, Loki reacting in complete horror after Doctor Strange throws him around for half an hour works because Thor's response is basically, yeah, that happens sometimes. Even the smallest moments help sell the relationship. Thor casually predicting Loki's betrayals, Loki looking genuinely offended when Thor claims he's changed, the fake emotional speeches, the awkward teamwork, everything feels lived in. And strangely enough, Ragnarok might be the first Thor movie where Loki actually feels lonely. Not in the dramatic, I want the throne way from the earlier films, more in the sense that he genuinely no longer knows where he belongs. Asgard doesn't trust him, Thor doesn't fully trust him. Even when he tries to help, people still expect betrayal first. There's a small moment near the ending where Loki returns to defend Asgard, and what makes it work is that the film doesn't transform it into some massive redemption speech. Thor simply accepts it, like, all right, you came back. That restraint matters, because the relationship becomes stronger once the movie stops forcing enormous emotional declarations every few scenes. Sometimes it's simply Thor and Loki standing beside each other watching their world collapse, while still exchanging sarcastic comments, because that's the only language they fully understand anymore. And honestly, that dynamic carried the Thor franchise for years. Even people who weren't particularly invested in the standalone films usually agreed on one thing. Whenever Thor and Loki shared scenes, the movies immediately became more engaging. Ragnarok understands that completely, so instead of emotionally separating them yet again, it finally allows them to evolve together. Not into perfect brothers, definitely not. Just into two chaotic disasters who somehow still care about each other underneath all the manipulation, resentment, history, and sarcasm. I honestly forgot how much of Ragnarok essentially functions as a Hulk movie until I revisited it. Yes, Thor is obviously the central character, but once the story reaches Sakaar, Hulk and Banner become such a major part of the film's energy that the whole thing almost transforms into this bizarre buddy comedy hidden inside a cosmic apocalypse story. And strangely enough, this might actually be the most entertaining use of Hulk anywhere in the MCU. Not necessarily the most emotional version of the character or the most intimidating one, but absolutely one of the most engaging. Because for the first time, Hulk is allowed to exist as more than simply rage monster appears, destroys everything, disappears again. That was always the limitation of Hulk in many earlier Marvel films. He would arrive for incredible action sequences, audiences would cheer, and then Banner would spend the rest of the runtime apologizing for the destruction afterward. Ragnarok is the first MCU movie that truly allows Hulk to become an actual personality instead of just a destructive force. And the film commits to that idea immediately. The arena reveal still works incredibly well because of how genuinely excited Thor becomes. Most superhero movies would frame that scene like a dramatic confrontation between unstoppable titans. Thor reacts like he accidentally spotted an old roommate at a concert. He's a friend from work. Audiences still respond to that moment every time. But honestly, the real strength of the dynamic begins after the fight. Because Hulk here isn't just smashing things anymore. He sulks, he argues, he gets jealous, he becomes emotionally offended. The movie essentially turns Hulk into a gigantic, frustrated toddler who also happens to be one of the strongest beings in existence. And somehow, it's hilarious without making him feel completely ridiculous. That balance is important because Hulk could have very easily become too cartoonish here. Some viewers already feel the film pushes him too deeply into comedy, and honestly, I understand the criticism. If you preferred the more terrifying Hulk from the earlier Avengers films, this interpretation definitely feels softer and much more playful. But personally, I appreciated finally seeing another side of the character. There's something strangely fascinating about the fact that Hulk has remained Hulk for so long on Sakaar that he's effectively built an entire life there. He has status, admirers, friendships, a home. He doesn't want Banner taking control again because, from Hulk's perspective, Banner ruins everything. And honestly, that becomes surprisingly sad if you think about it too deeply. Mark Ruffalo also gets far more to work with because of it. Usually, Banner spends MCU films anxious and desperately trying to remain calm. Here, once Banner finally returns after Hulk has controlled the body for 2 straight years, he's completely disoriented. The man has absolutely no idea what's happening anymore. He's trying to process alien planets, gladiator arenas, Thor suddenly behaving like an overly enthusiastic tourist, and the terrifying realization that if he transforms again, Banner himself might disappear permanently. That detail adds far more emotional weight than people usually talk about, because underneath all the humor, Banner is genuinely frightened throughout large portions of this film. There's this quiet panic sitting beneath his awkwardness the entire time. Ruffalo plays him like someone who feels disconnected from his own existence. Then 5 minutes later, Hulk throws a giant object directly into Thor's face for entertainment. That's kind of the brilliance of Ragnarok's tonal balance, honestly. The chemistry between Hemsworth and Ruffalo carries huge portions of the movie, and what makes it work is that they rarely behave like traditional superheroes around each other. They act like exhausted friends trapped together inside an increasingly chaotic situation. Thor constantly tries calming Hulk down like he's dealing with an emotionally unstable roommate, while Hulk continuously demands validation and attention in the funniest possible ways. The apartment scenes on Sakaar are honestly some of my favorite moments in the entire film. Watching Thor slowly realize Hulk has become a functioning member of alien society is genuinely great. Hulk lounging around his room like he owns the planet, proudly showing off his belongings, becoming annoyed whenever Thor insults him. It's such a strangely domestic presentation for a character usually associated with complete destruction. And I appreciate that the film never fully chooses between Hulk and Banner either. A lot of stories treat one version as the real person, while the other becomes the curse. Ragnarok makes the situation much messier than that. Hulk wants to live, Banner wants control back. Neither side is entirely wrong. They're both trapped inside the same body, arguing over existence itself, while Thor awkwardly attempts to mediate between them. Which sounds surprisingly thoughtful for a movie where Jeff Goldblum is hosting cosmic gladiator tournaments, but somehow it genuinely works. The film also quietly does something very smart with Thor and Hulk together. It humanizes Thor, because Thor spends most of the MCU surrounded by people who view him like a god. Hulk has absolutely no interest in any of that. Hulk treats Thor like an irritating equal. Sometimes less than an equal, honestly. And that dynamic forces Thor to become more relaxed, more awkward, and much funnier because intimidation simply has no effect on Hulk whatsoever. They bring out the most ridiculous sides of each other in the best possible way. And honestly, I still think Marvel missed a huge opportunity by not exploring this pairing more afterward. There's such an effortless chemistry between Thor and Hulk here that entire scenes function purely through interaction alone. The plot can temporarily pause, and it barely matters because simply watching these two argue is entertaining enough by itself. By the end of Ragnarok, both Hulk and Banner feel more complete than they had in years, not fully resolved. Definitely not emotionally healed, but more alive as characters, more distinct, more memorable, and honestly, that becomes one of the film's recurring strengths overall. Ragnarok takes characters who were beginning to feel trapped inside the larger Marvel machine and allows them to become strange again. One thing the movie does exceptionally well, and honestly better than a lot of MCU projects, is making even the supporting characters feel like they genuinely belong within this bizarre little universe, instead of standing around waiting for their next franchise appearance. Because this cast is crowded, genuinely crowded. You already have Thor, Loki, Hulk, Banner, Odin, and then the movie starts layering in Valkyrie, the Grandmaster, Korg, Heimdall, Scourge, Doctor Strange, random cameos, and somehow the film still mostly keeps everything balanced. That's actually pretty impressive. Valkyrie especially ended up being far more memorable than I expected the first time I watched the film. Usually in movies like this, new supporting characters feel very obviously introduced for future installments. You can practically see the important future franchise member label floating above them. But Tessa Thompson arrives in Ragnarok with this exhausted, chaotic energy that instantly makes Valkyrie feel perfectly aligned with the movie's tone. She isn't introduced as some flawless, noble warrior. She's intoxicated half the time, emotionally detached, and clearly trying to avoid confronting her past altogether. Honestly, her first entrance, drunkenly falling off the ship, basically tells you everything you need to know about the character immediately. And I appreciate that the movie never rushes to emotionally fix her. She stays rough around the edges throughout the entire story. Even when she eventually joins Thor's mission, it feels less like embracing heroic destiny and more like someone reluctantly deciding they might care again after all. Then there's Jeff Goldblum. Honestly, I still don't fully know how to describe what he's doing in this movie other than being Jeff Goldblum at dangerously elevated levels. The Grandmaster barely resembles a traditional MCU villain. He feels more like a cosmic celebrity who accidentally became ruler of an alien junk planet because nobody ever told him to stop. Every scene with him has this wonderfully unpredictable rhythm. He'll threaten someone and compliment their outfit in the same sentence. The movie wisely realizes there would be no point trying to make him conventionally intimidating, so instead it allows him to become this bizarre chaotic force drifting through Sakaar like he emotionally owns the universe, even if he doesn't physically control it entirely. And somehow it works every single time. Korg might secretly be the film's greatest supporting character, because on paper, Korg should not work at all. A giant rock alien revolutionary speaking with the gentlest possible voice sounds like a joke that should become exhausting almost immediately. But Taika Waititi performs him with such strange sincerity that every scene somehow becomes funnier the longer he talks. The Revolution pamphlet joke still completely lands for me. What makes Korg work is that he's never actively trying to become the funniest person in the room. He's simply existing calmly while the universe around him collapses into chaos. That contrast carries the entire character. And honestly, the movie needed someone like him because Ragnarok could have very easily become too aggressively sarcastic otherwise. Korg's humor feels lighter, almost oddly wholesome compared to everyone else's emotional dysfunction. Heimdall also finally gets more meaningful material here, which honestly felt overdue. Idris Elba always carried enormous screen presence in the earlier Thor films, but Heimdall mostly spent those movies standing around looking mythologically important while guarding portals dramatically. Ragnarok finally allows him to become active inside the narrative. He's protecting survivors, moving through Asgard like this mythological resistance figure, and for once the character actually feels essential instead of ornamental. Scourge is interesting too, because he exists somewhere between comedy and tragedy for most of the movie. Karl Urban plays him like a man desperately trying to survive whichever regime currently appears strongest. The film jokes about him repeatedly early on, especially during the entire "look at my guns" sequence, but later there's this strange sadness surrounding him because you realize he isn't evil in some grand mythological sense. He's weak, he wants approval, he wants safety, he wants to survive, and somehow the movie gives him a surprisingly effective payoff by the end. Doctor Strange's cameo is another element that easily could have felt forced but strangely doesn't. Mostly because the film understands not to overextend it. Strange appears, completely disorients Loki for a few minutes, helps push the story forward, and then disappears before the crossover novelty wears out its welcome. That's actually something Ragnarok handles very intelligently overall. The cameos feel playful instead of obligatory. Even the stage play sequence works because the movie fully understands how absurd it is. Matt Damon appearing as fake Loki sounds like a joke that should completely break immersion, but by that point, the film is already operating on such wonderfully chaotic energy that you accept it instantly. What's maybe most impressive, though, is that the supporting cast never fully overshadows Thor himself. That happens surprisingly often in large ensemble superhero films. Supporting characters become more entertaining than the protagonist and accidentally expose weaknesses in the lead. But here, everyone's individual weirdness actually helps Thor feel more alive because he constantly has different personalities to bounce off. Thor with Loki feels entirely different from Thor with Hulk. Thor with Valkyrie creates a different energy than Thor with Korg. Even Thor awkwardly interacting with the Grandmaster creates its own comedic rhythm. The movie continuously rotates character combinations, so the momentum never starts feeling repetitive. Now, are some characters underused? Absolutely. You can definitely feel the movie juggling too many moving pieces at times. Hela probably needed more scenes. Heimdall could have used additional focus. And some of the Warriors 3 are essentially removed from existence so quickly that it still feels surprisingly abrupt on rewatch. But overall, the supporting cast gives Ragnarok an enormous amount of personality that the earlier Thor films occasionally lacked. It makes the universe feel populated by actual oddballs, instead of generic fantasy figures standing around waiting for visual effects destruction to begin. Everyone is strange in slightly different ways, and somehow, that's exactly why the movie works. Hela is one of those Marvel villains where your opinion on the character depends almost entirely on what you value more, presence or depth. Because in terms of sheer presence, she absolutely enters this movie and takes control of it immediately. The moment Cate Blanchett appears, Ragnarok suddenly feels dangerous in a way the earlier Thor films honestly didn't. And I think a huge part of that comes from how effortlessly confident she is. Hela never behaves like someone trying to prove her power. She walks into scenes like a figure who already knows she's the most powerful person there. Then she destroys Mjolnir with one hand, and honestly, that moment still works unbelievably well. Marvel spent years treating Thor's hammer like this sacred, unstoppable object. Entire movies revolved around worthiness power and who was capable of lifting it. Then Hela casually catches it, crushes it, and instantly the film tells the audience, the rules are different now. No massive speech required. No extended exposition sequence, just one sharp crack. Honestly, that might be the smartest thing the movie does with her. it introduces Hela through action instead of explanation. By the time Hela reaches Asgard, everyone, including Thor, already understands they're completely outmatched. Visually, she's unforgettable too. The black armor, the glowing green energy, the enormous antlered headdress that somehow looks both magnificent and slightly absurd depending on the angle. She feels like a villain pulled from an older era of fantasy filmmaking in the best possible way. There's an almost theatrical quality to the performance at times, but Cate Blanchett commits so confidently that the exaggeration circles back around into becoming intimidating again. She genuinely looks like she's enjoying every second of it, and honestly, that matters more than people realize in a movie like this. Ragnarok already exists inside this heightened, bizarre comic book reality, so having a villain who fully embraces the madness helps the entire tone feel cohesive. If Hela had been played too grounded or overly restrained, she probably would have felt disconnected from the films surrounding her. Instead, she storms through Asgard launching blades at people like an ancient Gothic deity finally settling centuries of unresolved family resentment. That said, I completely understand some of the criticism surrounding the character too, because once you move beyond the visual style and sheer charisma, Hela doesn't actually receive an enormous amount of emotional exploration. The movie gives her a genuinely strong foundation, Odin's hidden firstborn, former conqueror of the realms, embodiment of Asgard's violent past, but it doesn't spend enough time fully unpacking those ideas. And strangely enough, some of the most compelling material involving her exists almost in the background. There's this darker layer underneath the story where Hela essentially exposes that Asgard's glorious history was built through conquest and bloodshed. Odin wasn't always the wise, peaceful ruler the earlier films presented him as. Hela represents the side of that history that was buried once Odin decided to reshape the kingdom's narrative. That's actually a really strong concept. But Ragnarok moves so quickly and spends so much time inside the comedic chaos of Sakaar that those themes never fully evolve into something emotionally heavier. Sometimes it feels like Hela belongs to a darker fantasy epic unfolding parallel to Thor's cosmic road trip comedy, and because of that, she occasionally feels isolated from the movie's emotional center. Thor and Loki are reconnecting, Hulk is participating in gladiator comedy, Korg is casually discussing pamphlets and revolutions. Meanwhile, Hela is back in Asgard executing soldiers and uncovering imperial history. Tonally, the separation can feel noticeable. I also think the movie intentionally avoids making her overly sympathetic. Modern blockbuster villains often receive enormous tragic speeches designed to reveal they were secretly right all along. Hela doesn't really operate that way. She's angry, ambitious, ruthless, and entirely consumed by power. The movie hints at deeper emotional damage beneath the surface, but it never pushes toward redemption or heavy moral complexity. And honestly, I appreciated that. Not every antagonist needs to become secretly misunderstood. Sometimes it's perfectly effective to let a villain dominate the screen through sheer personality and presence. Hela absolutely has both. Cate Blanchett's performance carries a huge amount of that naturally. The way she speaks, moves, and even smiles before attacking someone creates this constant feeling that she genuinely enjoys terrifying everyone around her. That confidence alone makes her more memorable than a lot of MCU villains who technically had more layered writing. I also love how personal the conflict feels. This isn't another random cosmic threat arriving to attack Earth. Hela is family. She's directly connected to Thor, Loki, Odin, and the entire hidden history of Asgard itself. Her existence forces Thor to realize that the kingdom he spent his life idealizing wasn't built as nobly as he believed. That's an incredibly strong foundation for a villain. And honestly, the film deserves extra credit simply because Hela feels powerful all the way through the story. Marvel villains sometimes have a habit of being introduced as unstoppable, only to suddenly become ineffective once the final act arrives. Hela never really loses that aura. Even at the ending, Thor doesn't truly defeat her through strength alone. The heroes essentially unleash Ragnarok itself because they realize brute force simply isn't enough. That makes her feel larger somehow, more mythological. Still, I can't completely call her one of Marvel's deepest antagonists. She's more iconic than emotionally layered, more memorable than psychologically complex. But in a movie already overflowing with comedy, color, spectacle, and chaos, maybe that was the correct choice. Sometimes a villain just needs to enter the movie, look incredible, destroy a legendary weapon in 5 seconds, and make everyone panic for the next 2 hours. Hela does that perfectly. One thing I genuinely miss whenever I revisit Thor Ragnarok and then watch certain modern blockbusters afterward is color, actual color, not 15 shades of gray pretending to equal seriousness. This movie looks completely insane sometimes, and I mean that as a genuine compliment. The earlier Thor films had moments of visual beauty, especially the first movie with all the golden Asgard imagery, but Ragnarok feels like someone finally gave Marvel permission to become visually unrestrained. Neon everywhere, hypersaturated palettes, massive glowing spacecraft, strange alien architecture, cosmic landscapes that look like they were painted onto the side of an arcade cabinet from the 1980s. And somehow it all fits the tone perfectly. Because the movie itself is already loud, strange, theatrical, and chaotic, the visuals stop trying to ground everything in realism. Instead, the film fully embraces comic book energy. You can feel Jack Kirby's influence all over this movie. The bold geometric designs, the oversized cosmic imagery, the exaggerated costumes. At times it genuinely feels like classic science fiction comic book panels exploding directly into live action. Especially Sakaar. Honestly, Sakaar might be one of my favorite visual environments Marvel has ever created because it feels completely unapologetic about its own weirdness. It's overcrowded, chaotic, ugly, beautiful, and overwhelming all at once. There's debris everywhere, strange alien species moving through every corner of the frame, massive towers glowing in the background, ships constantly flying overhead. The entire planet feels like a gigantic cosmic scrapyard operated by someone with absolutely no impulse control, which honestly describes the Grandmaster perfectly. I also love that Sakaar doesn't feel polished. A lot of futuristic worlds in major science fiction franchises end up looking overly clean or sterile. Sakaar feels lived in, chaotic, like Las Vegas collided directly with an intergalactic landfill during a cosmic music festival. Even tiny details in the background constantly grab your attention. That's probably one of the reasons the movie remains visually engaging on rewatches too. There's always some bizarre creature or strange production design detail happening somewhere in the frame. You can tell the creative team had an incredible amount of fun building this world. Then the movie cuts back to Asgard, which still looks grand and mythological, but darker now, more haunted somehow. That contrast works extremely well because Sakaar represents total chaos, while Asgard feels like a kingdom, quietly decaying beneath the weight of its own hidden history. Hela's presence transforms the atmosphere there completely. The gold and elegance from the earlier Thor films technically still exist, but now everything suddenly feels colder and emptier. Even Hela herself reshapes the visual identity of the film whenever she appears. That black and green color palette looks incredible against Asgard's brighter environments. And yes, the enormous antlered headpiece is objectively ridiculous, but it's the kind of ridiculous that somehow becomes iconic because the movie fully understands how theatrical she's supposed to look. Honestly, Ragnarok in general understands theatricality better than most Marvel films. There are shots throughout this movie that look deliberately excessive in the absolute best way possible. Thor standing in the middle of a lightning storm. Valkyrie's slow-motion flashback, riding directly into battle. Hulk launching himself toward Fenris in midair. Hela moving through collapsing armies throwing blades like she's conducting an orchestra of destruction. Ragnarok understands exactly when to stop pretending to be restrained and simply embrace full visual spectacle. And honestly, the retro influence running underneath the film helps enormously too. You can feel this strange 70s and 80s science fiction aesthetic woven through almost every frame, not in a parody sense, more like the movie grew up absorbing old fantasy paperback covers, heavy metal artwork, and synthwave album designs. The lighting, the color palettes, even the fonts and transitions occasionally feel intentionally old school in a way that becomes genuinely charming. Then there are the costumes. Thor's redesign alone immediately refreshes the character visually. The shorter hair, gladiator armor, war paint, suddenly he looks less like a traditional fantasy prince and more like someone surviving inside a cosmic death tournament. Valkyrie's design feels rougher, battle-worn, lived in. The Grandmaster dresses like the universe's strangest luxury fashion icon. Even Hulk gains visual personality beyond simply being large and green. The movie constantly uses appearance to communicate emotional identity. Now, obviously, a massive amount of Ragnarok relies heavily on CGI. There's no avoiding that reality. Entire environments are digital. Giant creatures appear constantly. Massive destruction sequences unfold every few minutes. And yes, occasionally you can absolutely feel the green screen overload. Some action scenes do drift into that modern blockbuster problem, where your eyes start glazing over because too much digital chaos is happening simultaneously. But honestly, compared to a lot of MCU films from that era, Ragnarok at least tries to make its visual effects memorable, and that matters. because spectacle alone becomes boring very quickly if every environment and action sequence starts blending together. Ragnarok avoids that problem by giving nearly every location its own visual identity. Asgard feels entirely different from Sakaar. Sakaar feels completely different from Earth. Hela's scenes carry a different visual atmosphere than Thor's gladiator sequences. The film constantly shifts visual energy, so it never fully settles into one repetitive aesthetic. And honestly, that's one of the reasons the movie stands out so strongly inside the MCU visually. You can pause random frames from Ragnarok and instantly recognize exactly which movie they came from. That sounds simple, but it's actually something many giant franchise films struggle to accomplish now. A lot of Marvel movies are entertaining. Ragnarok is one of the few that genuinely feels imagined instead of assembled. Okay, so obviously Thor. Ragnarok is overflowing with CGI. Absolutely overflowing. Entire planets are digital creations. Half the characters are motion captured, glowing, exploding, or flying through space every 10 minutes. There are giant wolves, undead armies, cosmic portals, lightning storms, spaceships crashing into things. This movie basically feels like a visual effects department being handed impossible instructions and told, good luck. But honestly, compared to a lot of modern blockbusters, I think Ragnarok handles its effects far better than people sometimes acknowledge, mostly because the movie understands one very important thing. If the world is going to be heavily artificial anyway, it should at least become visually interesting. That sounds obvious, but so many massive franchise films forget it entirely. They spend enormous amounts of money on effects and somehow still end up looking flat, gray, and emotionally lifeless. Ragnarok at least makes every major sequence feel visually distinct. The cinematography helps tremendously with that too. There are actual memorable images throughout this film. Not simply an action scene happened, but specific shots you genuinely remember afterward. Thor surrounded by lightning on the bridge. Valkyrie's flashback charging toward Hela's army in slow motion. Hulk diving toward Fenris midair. Even smaller moments, like Thor standing beneath Sakaar's neon lighting, remain visually stuck in your memory because the film frames scenes with personality instead of just functional coverage. And honestly, Marvel movies probably don't receive enough credit whenever they genuinely attempt visual stylization. A lot of MCU action sequences eventually begin feeling interchangeable, the same shaky movement. The same gray destruction clouds, the same giant energy beams shooting into the sky somewhere in the background. Ragnarok avoids much of that because the camera itself feels more playful. The compositions are bolder, the colors are stronger. Even the transitions between scenes feel more energetic. The movie actually wants you to look at it. Now, obviously, not every visual effect is flawless. There are definitely moments where the green screen environment becomes noticeable. Some Sakaar scenes especially have that ultra-clean digital texture Marvel occasionally struggles with. And once the third act fully enters apocalypse mode, there are moments where the sheer amount of CGI becomes so overwhelming your brain almost stops processing individual details. But honestly, that's almost unavoidable in movies operating at this scale. And strangely enough, I think the film's self-awareness helps soften that issue, because Ragnarok never pretends to exist inside grounded realism. It operates entirely within this exaggerated cosmic fantasy universe from beginning to end, so the heightened visual style actually works in the movie's favor. The artificiality becomes part of the charm rather than something constantly fighting against immersion. The Hulk effects are especially impressive on rewatch, not just technically, although the facial animation genuinely holds up remarkably well, but emotionally too. Hulk actually feels expressive here. You can read irritation, confusion, pride, jealousy, and even sadness across his face at different moments. That's a huge evolution from earlier MCU appearances where Hulk mostly functioned as an unstoppable force of destruction. There's one small moment where Hulk looks genuinely hurt after Thor insults him, and somehow the movie completely sells it despite the character being a giant green CGI gladiator. Honestly, that's kind of remarkable. Hela's powers also look fantastic throughout the movie. The way those black blades erupt outward whenever she attacks gives her actions scenes this sharp, elegant brutality that visually separates her from every other character. Thor's lightning abilities finally feel truly godlike too. Earlier films hinted at his power. Ragnarok makes it mythological, and then there's the final bridge battle. That entire sequence basically feels like the movie announcing, all right, let's use every remaining visual idea we have. Lightning storms, giant monsters, explosions, spaceships, immigrant song playing at maximum intensity. It's completely excessive in exactly the right way, and what prevents the scene from collapsing into visual chaos is the clarity of the staging. Even when destruction is happening everywhere, you usually understand where characters are, what they're doing, and why it matters. Honestly, that's underrated. Weak CGI isn't always about realism. Sometimes it's about confusion. Your eyes stop feeling impact because the action no longer has visual direction. Ragnarok mostly avoids that by giving its action scenes strong silhouettes and very clear movement. Thor flying through enemies while lightning explodes around him is easy to follow because the visual storytelling remains simple even when the scale becomes enormous. I also think the lighting deserves far more appreciation. Marvel films sometimes get criticized for looking too flat, especially during indoor sequences or action-heavy scenes. Ragnarok uses lighting much more aggressively. Sakaar glows with ridiculous neon colors. Hela's scenes lean heavily into blacks and dark greens. Asgard carries this golden mythological atmosphere slowly fading into destruction. The environments actually have emotional mood. And honestly, I would much rather watch a blockbuster that occasionally becomes too stylized than one that feels visually anonymous. Ragnarok swings hard aesthetically, sometimes maybe a little too hard. There are definitely moments where the digital environments become overwhelming or noticeably artificial, but at least the movie has visual confidence. It wants spectacle. It wants giant comic book imagery. It wants Thor to look like an actual lightning god, standing in the center of a Led Zeppelin album cover. And because the film commits so completely to that energy, the visual effects end up feeling exciting instead of merely expensive. That's the difference. A lot of blockbuster CGI impresses you technically for a few minutes and then completely disappears from memory afterward. Ragnarok actually leaves behind images, the action in Thor. Ragnarok also feels radically different from the earlier Thor films, and honestly, I think that's one of the biggest reasons audiences connected with it so strongly. The first two movies obviously had action sequences, but they often felt heavy. Lots of dramatic hammer swings, dark lighting, armored enemies crashing into each other with enormous seriousness. Ragnarok still delivers huge battles, but now everything moves with far more energy and personality. It's chaotic in a genuinely entertaining way. Even the opening Surtur fight immediately establishes the movie's approach. Thor is battling through a demon army while casually joking mid-combat, spinning around on chains, talking during fights, smashing skeleton creatures across the screen. The action is no longer trying to feel gritty or realistic. Its primary goal is entertainment. And honestly, that tonal shift helps enormously, because once the film reaches Sakaar, the entire movie basically transforms into a giant cosmic gladiator spectacle for a while. The arena sequence remains one of the most crowd-pleasing moments Marvel has ever produced, not even because of the choreography alone, although the fight itself is incredibly fun, but because the setup is perfect. Thor walks into the arena expecting execution. The audience erupts. Hulk bursts through the massive entrance like a professional wrestling superstar, and suddenly the movie reaches another level of absurdity. It's ridiculous in exactly the right way. And what I really appreciate is that the action scenes almost always carry some kind of character energy alongside the spectacle. Thor vs. Hulk isn't simply two powerful CGI figures punching each other. The entire sequence has personality woven through it. Thor's confusion, Hulk acting emotionally betrayed afterward, Loki panicking because he remembers exactly what happened to him during the Avengers. Even the humor layered inside the fight makes the sequence more memorable. That's kind of the movie's secret overall, honestly. The action rarely exists completely on its own. There's almost always another layer underneath it: comedy, character interaction, emotional payoff, visual absurdity, or pure mythological spectacle. Take the final battle in Asgard, for example. On paper, it's the most recognizable third-act Marvel climax imaginable. Massive armies, giant creatures, explosions everywhere, heroes scattered across a collapsing kingdom. But the movie stages everything with so much style and momentum that it mostly avoids feeling repetitive. And yes, a huge part of that is Immigrant Song. The second that music begins, the film essentially transforms into the greatest heavy metal fantasy artwork ever brought to life. Thor unlocking his full lightning abilities while charging through Hela's forces should honestly feel absurdly excessive, but by that point, the movie has completely earned the moment. It understands that superhero action works best when it emotionally commits instead of pretending to be grounded realism. The bridge battle especially looks incredible, Thor moving through enemies while lightning erupts around him, Valkyrie flying directly into combat, Hulk launching himself at Fenris like a gigantic green missile. The movie just keeps escalating visually until it reaches pure mythological chaos. And somehow the action still remains readable. That's something I appreciate even more on rewatch. modern blockbusters sometimes mistake visual noise for excitement. Everything shakes, explodes, cuts rapidly, and eventually you stop feeling impact because your brain can't fully process anything happening on screen anymore. Ragnarok gets close to overload at times, but most of the action still maintains strong visual clarity. You usually know where characters are, you understand the objective. The movie allows key moments enough space to actually land. Even the smaller fights stand out because of personality more than complexity. Valkyrie fights with reckless aggression that feels entirely different from Thor's more direct style. Hulk moves like an unstoppable natural disaster. Hela fights with this sharp, elegant brutality where every attack looks almost effortless. The action reflects who these characters are. Now, to be fair, I do think the movie occasionally leans too heavily into spectacle. There are moments where the CGI destruction starts blending together slightly, especially during the largest battle sequences. If you're already exhausted by modern blockbuster excess, parts of Ragnarok probably feel like sensory overload after a while. And honestly, some critics were absolutely right when they pointed out that the movie occasionally interrupts emotional tension with jokes too quickly. There are scenes where something genuinely important or emotionally heavy happens, and before the moment fully settles, another comedic beat arrives almost automatically. That approach works most of the time because the film is so confident tonally, but every now and then, you can feel the movie instinctively pulling away from seriousness. Still, I would always rather watch action with personality than another anonymous epic destruction sequence. That's the difference with Ragnarok. Even when it becomes messy, it stays memorable. You remember Hulk smashing through the arena. You remember Thor surrounded by lightning. You remember Hela walking effortlessly through armies. You remember Loki looking genuinely horrified during battles because he fully understands how catastrophic the situation has become. The movie understands that spectacle isn't only about scale, it's about moments. And honestly, Ragnarok is overflowing with them. Loud, excessive, ridiculous, occasionally chaotic, but in exactly the way a blockbuster should be. One thing Ragnarok completely understands is that music can fundamentally reshape how a superhero movie feels. And I don't just mean having a good soundtrack. Plenty of Marvel films have strong musical choices. Ragnarok uses music almost like an extension of its identity. The sound of the film is a huge part of why it feels so different from the earlier Thor movies. Because if you think back to the first two films, the music leaned heavily into traditional fantasy. Large orchestral themes, dramatic mythological scoring, everything designed to sound regal, ancient, and important. Then Ragnarok arrives sounding like a cosmic synthwave fever dream, and honestly, it's the perfect choice. The score carries this pulsing retro science fiction energy underneath everything. Synths, electronic textures, strange atmospheric sounds that make Sakaar feel even more alien and chaotic. It gives the entire movie this bizarre 80s fantasy atmosphere, like an arcade game somehow collided with Norse mythology, which sounds ridiculous. But honestly, that description basically applies to Ragnarok overall. What I love most is that the music never feels embarrassed by the movie's absurdity. Some superhero films use scores that desperately try to convince audiences everything on screen is overwhelmingly serious. Ragnarok leans fully into adventure instead. The soundtrack sounds genuinely excited to exist inside this world, and then there's Immigrant Song. Honestly, at this point, I don't even know what else can be said about it besides the fact that it completely dominates every single time it plays. It's one of those music choices that feels so perfect in hindsight, you start wondering how nobody used it for Thor earlier. The moment those opening guitar riffs hit during the action scenes, the movie instantly shifts into another emotional gear. Thor stops feeling like Marvel's superhero Thor for a few moments and starts feeling like an actual mythological rock god tearing through armies. The first use of the song is incredible. The second use somehow feels even bigger because by then Thor has fully embraced who he is without the hammer. Lightning erupting everywhere, chaos unfolding around him, Led Zeppelin roaring through the soundtrack. It's pure cinematic excess, but the movie commits so completely to the moment that resisting it becomes almost impossible. And what's interesting is that Ragnarok never overuses the song either. That restraint matters. Some films discover one powerful music cue and keep forcing it into every major sequence until the impact completely disappears. Ragnarok understands exactly when to deploy it. The movie treats Immigrant Song almost like a finishing move, but outside of Zeppelin, the smaller musical choices matter enormously too. There's this synth-heavy atmosphere woven throughout the film that constantly reinforces the retro science fiction aesthetic. Even quieter scenes on Sakaar carry this strange electronic pulse underneath them that makes the entire world feel alive, unstable, and slightly unhinged. The soundtrack isn't always trying to sound mythological or elegant. Sometimes it sounds playful, sometimes bizarre, sometimes almost hypnotic, which honestly matches Taika Waititi's directing style perfectly. The music also helps smooth over some of the movie's tonal unpredictability. And trust me, Ragnarok has tonal unpredictability everywhere. The story constantly jumps between apocalypse, comedy, gladiator spectacle, and emotional family drama. The soundtrack essentially becomes the connective tissue holding all those moods together, especially during transitions. There are moments where the visuals, editing, and music combine in this incredibly energetic way that keeps the movie moving before you even have time to stop and question how bizarre everything actually is. That's part of why Ragnarok feels lighter on its feet compared to some other MCU films. The soundtrack gives the movie rhythm. Even Hela's sequences benefit from that darker musical edge. Whenever the story shifts back to Asgard, the energy changes noticeably. The score becomes heavier, colder, more ominous. You can feel the contrast between Sakaar's chaotic party atmosphere and the growing sense of collapse back home. And honestly, I think the soundtrack deserves far more credit for helping the film establish its identity within the MCU. Because by this point, Marvel had already produced a huge number of movies, and one criticism people often had was that many of the scores started blending together. You remembered characters and action scenes, but not necessarily the musical personality of the films themselves. Ragnarok completely avoids that issue. You hear those synth textures or immigrant song and instantly know exactly what movie you're inside. That matters far more than people sometimes realize. Music is one of the fastest ways cinema creates emotional memory. It's why certain scenes stay locked in your head years later. And Ragnarok absolutely has those moments where image, action, and soundtrack collide perfectly. Thor landing while lightning explodes around him, and Zeppelin erupts across the soundtrack, honestly should feel absurdly excessive. But that's basically the entire philosophy of the movie. If you're going to make a cosmic Viking superhero film about the apocalypse, then it should sound incredible too. What's fascinating about Thor Ragnarok is that underneath all the comedy, neon chaos, and Jeff Goldblum eccentricity, it's actually a pretty sad movie. Genuinely sad. The thing is, the film hides its emotional core beneath so much humor that I think people sometimes forget just how much Thor loses throughout the story. By the ending, his father is gone, his hammer has been destroyed, his home no longer exists, most of the life he once understood has collapsed, and he's forced to redefine who he even is without the things that previously gave him identity. That's heavy material, but Ragnarok doesn't present grief in the typical superhero blockbuster way, where characters stare silently into the distance while emotional piano music plays for several uninterrupted minutes. The movie almost treats grief like something Thor barely has time to process because catastrophe keeps arriving faster than he can emotionally absorb it. And honestly, that feels strangely human. Thor spends most of the film joking his way through disaster. Sometimes the humor feels like confidence. Sometimes it feels like denial. Sometimes it genuinely feels like the only thing preventing him from emotionally collapsing while his entire world falls apart around him. The Odin scenes especially become much stronger on rewatch. Anthony Hopkins plays Odin with this quiet exhaustion that makes the entire sequence feel surprisingly real despite the fantasy setting. There's no enormous magical speech about destiny or honor. He's simply tired. He understands his time is ending. And for perhaps the first time in Thor's life, there's nobody left above him capable of fixing everything anymore. That's the real turning point for Thor as a character, because the earlier films still treated him like the reckless son learning lessons beneath Odin's authority. Ragnarok finally forces him into leadership without that protection. And the movie systematically strips away everything he once relied on. First Odin dies, then Mjolnir is destroyed, then Asgard itself faces annihilation. It's almost like the film is deliberately dismantling every previous version of Thor before rebuilding him into something entirely different. And honestly, that's why the "Are You Thor, God of Hammers" scene works so well. Because underneath the lightning effects and dramatic visuals, the moment is really about identity. Thor spent years tying his worth to external symbols, the hammer, the throne, the mythology surrounding him. Odin finally forces him to realize those things were never the true source of his power. Which sounds extremely superhero inspirational speech. When written out plainly, I know, but Hemsworth genuinely sells the emotional transition. There's this gradual evolution throughout the movie where Thor stops behaving like someone trying to become king and starts behaving like someone trying to protect people. That difference matters. Earlier versions of Thor often felt defined by destiny. Here, he becomes defined more by choice. And honestly, Loki plays a huge role in that emotional evolution too. Because for all the humor between them, Ragnarok quietly becomes the first Thor movie where the brothers stop viewing each other entirely through old resentment. Thor finally accepts that Loki is never magically going to become perfect, while Loki finally stops pretending he doesn't care about Thor at all. They're still dysfunctional disasters, obviously, but there's this growing acceptance between them that feels far more emotionally mature than the endless betrayal cycle from the earlier films. Then there's the idea of Asgard itself. I really love that the movie ultimately lands on the idea that Asgard isn't simply a kingdom, a palace, or a magical place floating through space. It's the people. That's actually a surprisingly powerful emotional conclusion for a movie this chaotic. Because Thor's final lesson isn't about preserving buildings or protecting tradition exactly as it existed before. It's about letting go of an idealized version of the past so something new can survive. And honestly, Hela strengthens that theme too. She isn't just physically destroying Asgard, she's exposing the darker truth buried beneath its history. Odin built the kingdom through violence and conquest before later rewriting the narrative into something nobler. Thor spends the entire movie slowly realizing the world he idolized was never as pure as he believed. That's a genuinely compelling theme for a Marvel blockbuster, especially one this funny. And honestly, I think that's why Ragnarok still works emotionally, even when it occasionally interrupts serious moments with jokes. And honestly, I think part of why Ragnarok stood out is because it recognized that exhaustion earlier than some other superhero movies did. Instead of trying to convince audiences this was the most important cinematic event in history, the film leans into personality, awkwardness, visual creativity, and absurd comedy. It understands people were becoming tired of formulaic seriousness. That's probably why even viewers burned out on Marvel sometimes admitted this movie felt fresher. Not because it completely escaped blockbuster culture, it absolutely didn't, but because it tried injecting actual style into the machine. It wanted to entertain through weirdness instead of scale alone. And honestly, blockbuster cinema desperately needs that, because there's nothing inherently wrong with spectacle. Large cinematic experiences can be incredible when they actually possess identity behind them. The problem begins when spectacle becomes automated, when every movie starts chasing the same emotional rhythm, the same visual language, the same franchise structure. That's when audiences stop feeling excitement and start feeling fatigue. You can already see that conversation happening around Ragnarok itself, honestly. Some viewers loved the movie because it broke away from Marvel's sameness. Others saw it as proof that Marvel had become too dependent on comedy and CGI overload to sustain emotional storytelling anymore. And honestly, both reactions make sense. Which is exactly why Ragnarok remains such an interesting blockbuster to revisit years later. It's simultaneously a celebration of modern franchise filmmaking and a reaction against it. The movie fully embraces spectacle while also quietly mocking the seriousness of spectacle itself. It delivers massive CGI chaos while constantly reminding you how absurd all of it really is. And honestly, that self-awareness helps, because underneath all the machinery, the film still feels human. You can feel Taika Waititi trying to inject actual personality into a system that could very easily flatten everything into anonymous franchise content if left unchecked. And honestly, maybe that's part of why Ragnarok aged better than certain other blockbuster movies from that era. Not because it escaped the machine entirely, but because it refused to become completely consumed by it. One thing that genuinely surprised me about Thor Ragnarok is how well it holds up on rewatches. Because honestly, comedy-heavy blockbusters can go in either direction. Sometimes you watch them once inside a packed theater, the audience energy carries everything, people are laughing together, and the whole experience feels electric. Then you revisit the movie years later at home and realize half the humor only worked because everyone in the room was having a great night collectively. Ragnarok definitely loses a little of that first viewing magic. That's unavoidable. The Hulk reveal obviously doesn't land the same way once you already know he's stepping into the arena. Surprise cameos naturally lose shock value. Certain punchlines inevitably hit harder the first time, but strangely enough, the movie still remains incredibly watchable. And honestly, I think a huge reason for that is rhythm. The film simply moves extremely well. Even when you already know every story beat, the pacing keeps pulling you forward. Scenes rarely drag. Character interactions remain entertaining. The visuals stay engaging. There's almost always some strange background detail or reaction shot you missed previously because the movie moves with such chaotic momentum. Honestly, I noticed more smaller jokes on rewatch than I did originally. Especially with Loki. Half of Tom Hiddleston's funniest moments barely even involve dialogue. It's just Loki standing silently in the background looking emotionally exhausted or deeply offended while everyone around him behaves like complete lunatics. Once you already know the plot, you start appreciating those tiny character details much more. Korg somehow becomes even funnier on repeat viewings too. I think partly because during the first viewing, you're still adjusting to the movie's comedic language. By the second or third watch, you fully understand the awkward rhythm the humor operates on, so the pauses and casual delivery land even harder. Some of Korg's dialogue honestly shouldn't be funny at all when written out plainly. But the timing completely carries it. And honestly, Ragnarok is one of those movies where audience energy matters enormously. I still remember watching it in theaters and hearing audiences genuinely lose control during certain scenes. Thor recognizing Hulk in the arena, Loki getting smashed around again, the Get Help sequence, Grandmaster casually speaking nonsense while chaos unfolds around him. The film creates this constant wave of audience reaction where people never fully settle down. That communal energy helps tremendously. Because unlike certain Marvel movies that ask viewers to sit quietly and absorb mythology for extended stretches, Ragnarok wants audiences reacting constantly. Laughing, cheering, groaning at intentionally ridiculous jokes. It feels designed for crowd interaction in a very classic blockbuster way, and honestly, those movies are fun. Sometimes online film discussions become so obsessed with seriousness that people start acting like every movie needs to emotionally devastate you or reinvent cinema itself in order to matter. But there's something genuinely impressive about keeping a giant audience consistently engaged for 2 straight hours. Ragnarok does that exceptionally well. Now, I do think the rewatch experience changes emotionally after Avengers. Infinity War and Avengers, Endgame though, because the first time you watch Ragnarok, the ending feels strangely hopeful despite Asgard's destruction. Thor finally grows into leadership. Loki returns to help. The survivors escape together. There's this sense that maybe the worst has finally passed. Then Infinity War arrives almost immediately afterward and basically responds, absolutely not. So now, revisiting Ragnarok carries this strange, bittersweet atmosphere underneath parts of it. Some of the joy feels temporary in retrospect because you already know what's waiting for these characters next. Odin's death lands differently. Thor's emotional growth feels more tragic. Even Loki's quieter moments carry extra emotional weight now knowing where his story eventually leads. And honestly, that unintended emotional layer actually enriches the movie on rewatch. At the same time, though, some aspects of Ragnarok absolutely rely on surprise and momentum. Certain jokes naturally lose impact once you already know them. A few cameo moments feel more like quick novelty outside the theater environment. And if someone already struggled with Marvel's comedy style, repeated viewings probably amplify those frustrations instead of softening them. I can completely understand someone revisiting the film and thinking, all right, this constant joke-driven approach is becoming a little excessive now. That reaction is fair. But personally, I think what keeps Ragnarok alive years later is personality. The movie has such a distinct voice compared to many blockbuster franchise films that even when individual surprises fade, the overall energy still carries everything. You spend time with these characters rather than simply watching plot mechanics unfold. Thor and Hulk arguing still works. Valkyrie stumbling through emotional denial still works. Loki being simultaneously helpful and deeply suspicious still works. The movie creates this strangely comfortable atmosphere despite the apocalypse constantly happening around everyone. And honestly, that's probably why audiences revisit it so often. Not because it's the deepest Marvel film, not because it's the most emotionally devastating, not even because it's narratively perfect. People return because it's enjoyable spending time inside this version of the MCU. It's colorful, strange, fast, funny, slightly chaotic, occasionally messy, but never boring. And honestly, for a franchise movie, arriving nearly 20 films into a cinematic universe, that's a far bigger achievement than it sounds. At the end of the day, I think what makes Thor Ragnarok stay in people's memories isn't simply that it's funny or visually wild or packed with action. Plenty of blockbusters have those qualities. What really separates it is that it genuinely feels like a movie that changed the direction of a character, and honestly maybe even shifted the MCU itself for a while afterward. Because before Ragnarok, Thor was never really the fan-favorite Marvel hero in the same way Iron Man or Captain America were. People liked him, certainly, but the character often felt trapped between tones. Too serious to fully embrace the cosmic weirdness, too mythological to fit naturally beside Marvel's more grounded characters. Then Taika Waititi arrives and essentially says, What if we stop resisting the weirdness entirely, and suddenly Thor becomes one of the most entertaining personalities in the entire franchise? Honestly, that's an enormous achievement. Reinventing a major character 17 movies into a cinematic universe should not work this smoothly. Most franchises at that stage start feeling safer, more manufactured, more exhausted. Ragnarok somehow does the opposite. It feels looser, stranger, more confident in its own identity. And yes, it absolutely becomes messy at times. I don't think the movie is perfect at all. The tonal balancing act occasionally stumbles. Certain emotional moments deserved more breathing room. Hela probably could have been explored much more deeply. A few jokes absolutely push scenes too far into parody territory. And if someone already dislikes Marvel's increasingly comedy-heavy style, this film probably feels like the exact moment the MCU leaned too heavily into nonstop humor. Those criticisms are completely valid. But honestly, I think the movie earns a tremendous amount of forgiveness because of how alive it feels. That's the word I keep returning to with Ragnarok. Alive. The characters feel energized again. The visuals feel imaginative instead of merely functional. The comedy feels strange and specific rather than completely engineered by committee. Even while operating inside Marvel's enormous franchise machinery, you can still feel an actual filmmaker forcing personality into the system. And audiences responded to that immediately. You could genuinely feel it when the movie released. Suddenly, people who barely cared about Thor beforehand were excited about the character. Thor stopped being the serious mythology guy and became this chaotic, emotionally overwhelmed cosmic disaster, somehow surviving impossible situations through confidence, stubbornness, and sheer momentum. Honestly, Chris Hemsworth deserves enormous credit for embracing that reinvention so fully. A lot of actors resist dramatic tonal shifts with iconic characters because they worry it will make the role feel less important. Hemsworth leans directly into the comedy and somehow ends up making Thor feel more human because of it. And the film's influence on Marvel afterward is difficult to ignore too. After Ragnarok, the MCU became far more open to directors bringing stronger personal styles into these projects. You started seeing more experimentation with tone, genre, visual identity, and humor throughout the franchise. Some of those experiments worked better than others, obviously, but Ragnarok proved audiences were hungry for superhero movies that felt distinct instead of interchangeable. It also quietly became one of Marvel's most rewatchable films, not necessarily because it's the deepest entry or the most emotionally layered, but because it's just incredibly easy to revisit. The pacing moves effortlessly. The character chemistry still works. The visuals hold up remarkably well. Most of the humor still lands. And even when certain jokes lose their surprise factor, the overall energy continues carrying the movie forward. There's almost a strange comfort to it. A weird cosmic comfort built out of neon chaos, Led Zeppelin, sibling dysfunction, gladiator arenas, and apocalypse-level destruction. Which honestly sounds ridiculous when described out loud, but somehow Ragnarok makes all of it feel completely natural. And honestly, I think that's probably the film's real legacy. Not simply that it reinvented Thor, but that it reminded blockbuster franchises they're allowed to become strange, allowed to take tonal risks, allowed to have personality instead of relying entirely on scale. Because the movie could have played everything safely. Another dark fantasy sequel, another generic Save the Kingdom storyline, another chapter existing primarily to move pieces around the MCU chessboard. Instead, Ragnarok became this bizarre collision of cosmic fantasy, buddy comedy, mythology, retro science fiction, emotional family drama, and full-scale rock concert energy all smashed together into one enormous colorful spectacle. And somehow it worked, not perfectly, but memorably. And honestly, in a franchise this massive, memorable matters far more than perfect.